So, buenos días a los amigos nuestros en la América Latina. Good afternoon to some, and good evening here in the Philippines. Bienvenidos todos. Welcome to the panel B of the session 7 of the Philippine International Quincentennial Conference. I am Rene Salvania from the University of the East in Manila and member of the board of Philippine Academic Consortium for Latin American Studies, or PIQC. I will be the moderator for today's panel entitled Trade and Cross-Cultural Encounters in Nuevo Mundo. We are currently live on almost 100 Facebook pages, primarily at the National Quincentennial Committee, Department of Foreign Affairs, and other foreign service posts, National Historical Commission of the Philippines, and the National Commission for the Culture and the Arts, among others. To formally start today's talks, let us listen to the welcome message of Dr. Ferdinand C. Llanes, University of the Philippines professor and chair of PIQC. Dr. Llanes.
Good evening from Manila. Good morning or good afternoon in Latin America. In the 15th century, Europe was fascinated with Asia, India in particular, and also China. Blame it on Marco Polo with his fantastic tales about the wealth of Asia. It was the concept, the images of India and also China that brought Europe to Asia. But before finding Asia, they found Africa, in the case of the Portuguese, and then America, in the case of Spain and other European nations. They had to make the mistake of thinking that America was India, and for which later the indigenous peoples of America and Filipinas would forever be condemned as Indios. Europe's declining feudal order and the rising commercial strides of the era, emboldened by advances in navigation and Christianity's crusading spirit, will determine centuries of unequal relations. But beyond the wrongs done, new connections were established. Commerce brought peoples and cultures together in vibrant and meaningful interactions. Moreover, in the course of the conquista for land and profit, new social forces emerged. New nations were created. New destinies were forged in the crucible of struggle and resistance. In the process of exchanging trade goods, flora and fauna, even revolutionary ideas. America Latina, as a concept and as a reality, came to life, came into being, the same as Filipinas, as pueblos different from the peninsula. Through the conquista, cultures and trade goods came into more meaningful contact and exchange among the colonized peoples. At the same time, that the power of the mestizaje and the Indio came to determine sovereign rights, sovereign paths. Beyond the collision of cultures, there was also the fusion of aspirations. Cuban ilustrados met with Filipino ilustrados in Madrid. Mexican deportados mixed with Filipino deportados in places of exile in Filipinas. Latin America and Filipinas have much to share in these meaningful contacts and exchanges in the past. It is something that we have to recover. There is so much to recover in our common experiences, in our common circumstances and destinies in the past. Hay mucha que podríamos recuperar. And for today and the future, there is so much to build and develop. Hay mucho que podríamos desarrollar. It is in this close and historic fraternal spirit, como hermanos, that we celebrate. We welcome your coming to this occasion and commemorate the quincentennial in our rising and becoming a truly just and meaningful Nuevo Mundo. Viva America Latina y Filipina. Magandang gabi po sa inyo. Good evening and also good morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Llanes. Muchas gracias. Thank you for that incision into history. At the same time, you're challenging our people, both worlds. Thank you very much. Yesterday's topic was Peoples and Heritage in the Filipinas Mexico-Peru Network. Our distinguished speakers left us mentalmente empachado when they talked about the intercambios or exchanges that took place between Philippines and Mexico and Peru. Intercambios of goods and productos agrícolas like maíz, café, camote, tomate, cacahuetes, including tuba, and even intercambios of language and traditions. I use the word intercambio or exchanges because the conquistadores brought us some things, but they also brought some things back home, including perhaps their Filipino wives. Tonight's topic is trade and cultural encounters in Nuevo Mundo. We have a lineup of 5 excellent speakers. Our first speaker is a history professor of the University of Asia and the Pacific and a prolific member of the board of PIQC. She is an accomplished woman in her own right. Hojeando en su biografía, browsing through her curriculum vitae, I noticed that she has special inclination towards mujeres en la historia, the role of women in history. Tonight, she will talk again about women, her 10th research work on women. The title is Legislating Bride Wealth and Bride Price, Making Cross-Cultural Connections in the Colonial Hispanic World. Damas y caballeros, let us give a virtual clap to Dr. Maria Svetlana T. Camacho. Yvette, you're mute.
Sorry. So good evening to those who are here in the Philippines, and good morning in maybe Southeast Asia, and good morning to those who are on the other side of the world. First of all, I'd like to thank the Quincentennial Committee, the Department of Foreign Affairs, and PIQC for inviting me to make a presentation in this panel. Among my work, I was thinking of what could fit the theme of this panel. So it's this one. You will eventually find out why. So let me start. typo. So sorry. So in 1704, Governor General of the Philippines, Domingo de Sabalburu, promulgated a decree to execute Law 6, Title 1, Book 6 in the Recopilación de las Leyes de Indias of 1681 in the Philippines. In sum, the law prohibited Indians from selling their daughters into marriage. Que los indios no puedan vender sus hijas para contraer matrimonio. The law stated, by receiving bride service or gifts from the suitor. Tabalburu explained that in this matter he was collaborating with the Archbishop of Manila, Diego de Camacho, who was of the opinion that uniting secular and ecclesiastical authority would render more effective the enforcement of the previous measures in that regard. The source decree signed by Philip IV in Madrid on 29th of September 1628 was included in the chapter specific to the natives or the Indios in the Imperial Legal Code for the Indies and had been addressed originally to the Audiencia of Guatemala. Purportedly, it was the royal sanction to an earlier ordinance. So the sanctions, as you could see, are here. So we have, I just put here the translation from the original decree applied to the Masewal, of Guatemala in Mesoamerica, and translated for the Philippine setting to Timahua. So this is practically the entire decree was adopted in the Philippines. They just translated or adapted the social classes using the native terms, the Philippine terms. So this paper discusses the convergence of indigenous marriage customs in Mesoamerica and the Philippines and its cultural connections with other parts of island Southeast Asia in colonial enactments. Upon discovering cultural similarities between the two sides of the Pacific, Philippine colonial authorities considered the aforementioned law apropos to the local scenario they were trying to change. Although the rationale behind that law is to be understood from the perspective of Spanish Catholic conception of marriage, today it provides a window to a comparative historical view of the practice of bride wealth and bride service in two regions of the early modern Spanish Empire. While not a case of actual confluence, nonetheless, it is illustrative of cross-cultural, trans-Pacific connections adumbrated in the past, which today lends itself to ethno-historical study. Furthermore, this is an example of how a normative encounter within the colonial setting shaped imperial lawmaking. The frame of reference shifts from being centered in Spain to become more global, as imperial law was localized in diverse societies and cultures. In the Captaincy General or Audiencia of Guatemala, the Audiencia was the highest tribunal and also acted as an advisory body to the Captain General. In 1626, the Audiencia reported that one of its judges, Juan Maldonado de Paz, had completed his inspection tour, La Visita a la Tierra, of the provinces of Soconusco and the larger part of Zapotitan and Verapaz. Aside from lightening the burdens of tribute and correcting injustices, he issued ordinances for the governance of the natives. The seventh ordinance addressed the abuse, and quote-unquote, the pagan custom of the natives of selling their daughters into marriage to the men of their choosing, which caused great damage and disturbance because it violated the freedom of marriage, particularly of the women. To remedy the consequent maltreatment of wives and infidelity, Maldonado de Paz prohibited the practice of receiving service from the prospective bridegroom, imposing the corresponding penalties of 50 lashes, ineligibility for public office, and surrender of the amount received, and for the principal or the elite, demotion to masewal or commoner status. A comparison of the ordinance with the royal decree in its version in the Recopilación de Leyes de Indias shows that while the latter practically repeated the former, it elaborated on the nature of the offensive payment, ni en servicio, ni en otro género de paga en especie, neither in the form of service nor any other type of payment in kind. The account of the Franciscan Diego de Landa, La Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, is the main colonial source about Maya society and culture, since most of Guatemala is populated by Maya, as indigenous people. The combined methods and sources from archaeology and anthropology from which ethnohistory has drawn provide more data and deeper insight into the world of the Maya and the women's place in it. Bishop Landa wrote in the mid-16th century, in the post-classic age of Maya civilization and the first decades of the Spanish conquest. He explained how the parents of the prospective spouses betrothed their children at a much younger age, at puberty, than in olden times when the usual marrying age was 20. The boy's parents took care of looking for a bride, as much as possible from the same social class and locality. The parents then arrived at an agreement about the dote and the aras, which did not amount to great values among commoners. The boy's father gave the dowry to the girl's father, and in addition, the boy's mother prepared clothing for the couple. After the wedding, auxiliary local residence was the practice. The groom worked for 5 to 6 years for his father-in-law. If he neglected his duties, that was sufficient reason for his in-laws to make him leave the house, which was tantamount to separating the couple. The wife's mother saw to it that her daughter fed her husband as a sign of the parents' recognition of their marriage. While bride service in the early years of Yucatec Maya marriage was a general practice, it is not certain whether living in the woman's family residence during the period of betrothal was. Although the ordinance issued by Juan Maldonado de Paz would seem to refer to bride service prior to marriage to be rendered by the prospective groom, it could also be ambivalently interpreted as part of the agreement to be implemented after marriage. Colonial authorities objected to this practice as it was open to the possibility of separation and remarriage if the man did not prove satisfactory to the parents. And if rendered prior to marriage, in the language of commodification used by the aforementioned law, the woman was likely to be coerced to marry the man that her parents had, quote-unquote, sold her to. Also, it heightened the incidence of premarital sexual relations due to co-residence. Now, about the practice of bride wealth and bride service in the Philippines. Spanish chroniclers, both secular and religious, invariably mention the bride wealth or the bride gift as the critical factor in arranging marriages in the Philippines. They generally use the term dote, which in European usage was given by the woman's family to the man, with some pointing out that the Philippine custom was the reverse. In the 17th century lexicons, namely the Visayan Spanish Diccionario by Alonso de Mentida and the Tagalog-Spanish Vocabulario Tagalog by Francisco de San Antonio, Bugay or Bugay and Bigay Kaya respectively are translated as dote. The usage of dote appears conceptually consistent across the sources for this period, and only exceptionally was the indigenous term mentioned. The Spanish authors understood that the dote went to the bride's parents and kin, who might give part of it to the bride or use a portion of it for the wedding. The writers invariably used the language of commodification, using verbs such as pay, purchase, and sell. Some religious authors compared the practice to that obtaining among other peoples, such as the Mesopotamians, ancient times, Jews, the Chinese, and the Japanese. That bride wealth was described as consisting mainly of prestige goods, including slaves, suggests that the wealthy elite could afford to give it. Some chroniclers noted that fathers usually asked for the same amount as the bride wealth they had given for their wives, but not all suitors could match this demand. Fenella Canel explains that bride wealth established a kind of equilibrium between the families of the groom and the bride. For the bride's family, a sizable bride wealth symbolized their status, while for the bridegroom's side, matching the demand was a status-building strategy. Inasmuch as the marriage prestation benefited the daughter's family to whom it was distributed, especially those who had been directly involved in raising her, they were expected to contribute to the bride wealth for the son's betrothal when their turn to marry came around. Thus, bride wealth signified the kinship solidarity as well as alliance building effected through the institution of marriage. The Jesuit Francisco Ignacio Alsina mentioned the bride service both as a pre- and post-nuptial practice, although it is unclear whether both were required of the same person. The duration of bride service was longer for those who could not afford the entire value of the bride wealth required by the woman's family. The post-nuptial bride service could last for a few years up to a lifetime, according to him. Seen within the context of Southeast Asian betrothal and marriage practices and relative to these women's socioeconomic condition, the discussion of bride wealth and bride service in the Philippines gains in depth and breadth. Southeast Asian women's childbearing capacity, high economic value, and relatively greater autonomy were interrelated. The practice of bride wealth can be explained in this context. Compared to the African custom in which the wealth remained with the male line, the Southeast Asian bride benefited, even in part, from the wealth transferred to her parents through inheritance. Anthony Reid observed that in island Southeast Asia, if the husband initiated divorce, the wife kept the bride wealth, whereas in the contrary case, she had to restitute it. Divorce did not put the woman in a precarious position as far as economic needs, family support, and status were concerned. In the agricultural economy of Southeast Asia, daughters were considered economically advantageous because the payments to the woman's family were greater in the reciprocal exchange leading up to marriage. The bride wealth for one's daughter enabled the father to repay his debts incurred for the same purpose. In Southeast Asian societies, where agreements or what might be considered contracts concerning goods and property were orally formalized, the matrimonial prestations were made public through the presence of witnesses. For indigenous societies, the primary concern of law in regard to betrothals and marriage was to preserve communal peace given the strong familial involvement in those institutions. Also, that peace was needed to establish a new household. In colonial Philippines, as this paper discusses, the rationale revolved around the freedom of marriage and premarital chastity in accordance with Catholic norms. So in the Spanish colonial regime in the early modern period, the church legislated about marriage as such and exercised jurisdiction over it, determining the validity of betrothals and marital unions and settling matrimonial cases. The Council of Trent configured canonical marriage to give it a more public character. The mutual and free consent of the spouses was reinforced as the essential element of marriage, and corollary to that, the emphasis on freedom of marriage. The Church took pains to safeguard the freedom of consent, that is, the external manifestation of the internal willingness to marry, and therefore the freedom from coercion resulting from fear. The question of requiring parental consent was important in the Americas as it was in Europe in view of the indigenous practice of parents choosing spouses for their children and arranging marriages. Although the church respected parental authority and understood the value of seeking parental advice, Ultimately, it favored freedom of marriage. Thus, the Council of Trent declared that marriages celebrated without parental consent were valid. Another pastoral concern was to avoid undue delay of marriage and cohabitation before the wedding. The value given to premarital chastity and to freedom of consent were the main reasons for the ecclesiastical objection to the indigenous customs of bridal and bride service, as will be discussed in the next few minutes. There. Until further research brings to light documentation of the Church's position on bride wealth and bride service from the early 17th century, the oldest we have seen so far dates back only to the late 17th century. In the Diocese of Nueva Cáceres in the Bicol region, bishops in succession reiterated their predecessors' pronouncements on these customs. The earliest normative reference was the ordinance issued by Bishop Andres Gonzalez, in which he prohibited servicio personal, nor bride service, and imposed fines on violators and on those who reneged on marriage promises due to their inability to provide the dowry, or bride wealth would be the equivalent. Gonzalez also prohibited the practice of giving the pasuso, or the gift, to the mother, which among the components of bride wealth was among the most important. In a radical motion, he attempted to reverse the meaning of bride wealth and convert it to the European notion of donatio pro nuptias as a means of support to the newlyweds. It was to be given to the parents of the bride shortly before the wedding, with the guarantee that the couple should receive the totality of it. The bishop's ultimate objective was to prevent women from being forced into marriage by their parents and relatives for whom there was no turning back after having spent the gifts and money received from the prospective bridegroom. So far, there's no evidence to indicate that this particular mandate was enforced. The bishops established normative continuity as Bishop Gonzalez's ordinance became the base reference for his successors. Ecclesiastical authorities were to call on secular authorities for assistance to carry out the punishment of transgressors. It must be noted that none of them referred to royal law to support their censure, but remained strictly on canonical and moral grounds. Thus, Archbishop Camacho's campaign to abolish those marriage prestations which antedated Sabalburo's decree was in effect contemporaneous with Bishop Gonzalez. Till the end of the 18th century, Philippine ecclesiastical authorities strove to moderate, if not eliminate, bride wealth and bride service, as the pastoral letters of the bishops and the decrees of the Provincial Council of Manila and the Synod of Calasiao attest to. This law, with its basis on the royal decree found in the Recopilación de las Leyes de las Indias, was echoed subsequently in other provinces. So this paper has comparatively discussed the indigenous matrimonial prestations practiced in two societies, one on each side of the Pacific, which the Spanish colonial authorities sought to regulate. This is but one instance that demonstrates how royal legislation in regard to indigenous societies had discerned certain social-cultural and institutional commonalities that permitted royal decrees for specific circumscriptions to be applied in other Spanish overseas territories. From our present-day perspective, what might be termed as legal translation or a case of localization of imperial law has become a channel of trans-Pacific confluence, at least conceptually. In this manner, legal history could provide a global perspective on less conspicuous, less studied aspects of the Hispanic colonial world which straddled the Pacific. In the particular topic of this paper, the Philippines is presented as the entry point to Southeast Asia in relation to Latin America in the early modern period. The broader comparative scope through the lenses of law allows for mutually enriching interpretations of bride wealth and bride service. Their practice in the Philippines in pre-colonial and early colonial period is better understood within the context of their practice in Southeast Asia, particularly the maritime part. especially their meanings which render ineffectual the attempts of colonial authorities to eradicate those customs. The similar meanings found in Mesoamerican and Southeast Asian societies point to the appreciation accorded to women within their kinship group and household. While their economic value and childbearing role have often been highlighted, the less perceptible and less articulated contributions of the mother and wife could only be deduced from the importance of the gift owed to the prospective mother-in-law, which formed part of the bride wealth. In this respect, modern anthropology has been able to go beyond the limitations of the historical description and interpretation of these marriage prestations, which, on the other hand, has given diachronic breadth to the knowledge of those customs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Camacho, for that beautiful dissection of story of marriage and marital relationships. Okay, so for the next ponencia, we have two speakers who will discuss the stay of Magellan's fleet in Rio de Janeiro, mariners and natives in Guanabara Bay. They are Professor Dr. Roberto Diaz Pereira and Professor Dr. Paulo Naus. They are both professors of history at the Universidade Federal Fluminense in Rio de Janeiro. Professor Diaz is a literary critic, historian, essayist, and author of books. As a literary critic, he is a member of Pen Clube de Brazil, that is, poets, essayists, and novelists. He is also a member of Academia Carioca de Letras, Academia Luso Brasileiro de Letras, and Academia de Letras de Bahia. He still has a long list of achievements, but to enumerate them will lead us deep into the night. So just to prove how prolific writer he is, let me just mention that he published 6 essays on Brazilian colonial period and authored 8 books. No wonder he is a recipient of 5 medals of honor. On the other hand, Dr. Naus is more occupied with managerial posts aside from teaching. At present, he is the director of the National Historical Museum and at the same time, General Director of the Public Archives of the state of Rio de Janeiro. He is dedicated to the management of collection and archives, curatorship of exhibits, and research on cultural heritage history. Despite his busy schedule, he was able to publish 3 books. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professors Dr. Diaz and Dr. Naus.
So, good morning or good evening to everyone. Thank you, Mr. Sylvania. And first, in my name and in the name of my colleague, Dr. Paulo Roberto Pereira, I would like to thank the invitation to participate on the Philippine International Quincentennial Conference. We would like to thank especially to all who worked to make this event possible. Of course, we are also glad to share this session with the other Latin American panelists and the other colleagues, and of course with our audience, building bridges between East and West. In this occasion, our aim is to consider how the state of the Magellan's fleet in the Bay Area current named Rio de Janeiro in Brazil has contributed to success of the route chosen by the Spanish seamen down the South Atlantic until the strait which bears the navigator's name. That was the reason for the achievement of the International Quincentennial Anniversary Seminar of the First Circumnavigation, the stay of the fleet in Rio de Janeiro, which happened in December 2019 in the city of Rio de Janeiro, of which we were scientific coordinators. The seminar and its proceedings with the contributions of scholars of Portugal, Spain, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Peru, and Brazil, intended to enhance the view about the history of the first circumnavigation of the world from a South American perspective, what can be seen as an original contribution to historiography, since the dominant focus is oriented towards the Far East. Magellan's travel took place just 20 years after Pedro Alves Cabral's fleet had discovered the land of Brazil in 1500. Cabral's travel plays an important role in the economic, political, and cultural exchanges of the European expansion during the 30 years from 1492 with the discovery of America by the first Christopher Columbus voyage to 1522 with the return of the vessel Victoria to Seville under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano. The search for a way to arrive in the east through the west became a Spanish project after the discovery of America, the Treaty of Tordesillas, and especially after Vasco Núñez de Balboa had crossed the Isthmus of Darien in 1530. The Spanish navigator became the first European to contemplate the Pacific, which he baptized Mar del Sur. However, the search of a way which would allow to cross Mar del Sur towards the Spice Islands from the Atlantic had failed with the voyages of Christopher Columbus, Amerigo Vespucci, and Juan Diaz de Solis. The accidental discovery of the Pacific Ocean through the Isthmus of Panama by Balboa is different from the Magellan's voyage, which was carefully planned and prepared. The long maritime experience of the originally Portuguese commander had made familiar the route which he should take through the South American coast as he carried the maps and the itinerary of the travels accomplished by the predecessor navigators such as Juan Diaz de Solis. With the absence of the astronomer Rui Faleiro, who had joined Magellan to sign the Capitulaciones de Valladolid with Charles V to hold the travel to the Spice Islands, he took on board the cosmographer Andrés de San Martin. So the fleet under his command set sail from Seville and later San Lucar de Barrameda port on September 20, 1590, consisting of 5 vessels and about 265 seamen. He collected provisions on the Canary Islands, sailed down the Atlantic until Serra Leoa to accomplish the Volta Mina, crossed the ocean, and on December 13, 1519, he arrived at Guanabara Bay, also known as Rio de Janeiro, the first port visited in the Americas by the Spanish fleet, anchoring on an island that was originally known as Gato Island or Paranapuá Island, the current Governor Island, where they stayed until December 27, 1519, precisely a stay of 15 days. To sail around the Brazilian coast, Magellan's fleet followed João Lopes de Carvalho's instruction, who was the Portuguese pilot of the Concepcion vessel and had lived in the Bay Area of Rio de Janeiro before. Thus, Magellan had authorized João Lopes de Carvalho to lead the Spanish fleet from Cabo Frio until the area of Rio de Janeiro because he knew how to navigate in the South Atlantic, as he had been in the trade posts built by the Portuguese in the region, spending more than 4 years in Guanabara Bay between 1511 and 1516. Back to Rio de Janeiro, with the Magellan fleet, João Lopes de Carvalho met his son that he had with a native from the Bay Area when he lived in the Rio de Janeiro in the region before. His son was known as Joãozinho or João Ninhito, what could be translated as Little John. The unexpected is that this young Brazilian boy, if we can say so, from the Rio de Janeiro Bay Area, participated in the crossing of the Magellan Strait with his father, surviving the hard trip they had taken for the very first time in the Pacific waters until the Philippines. The commander of this legendary journey, Ferdinand Magellan, as known, died on Mactan Island in the Philippines on April 27th, 1521, when he had to fight the island's native ruled by their chief Lapu-Lapu. Therefore, in this sea adventure, where the globalization era had one of its starting points, we can include Joãozinho Lopes de Carvalho for being the first indigenous from the land of Brazil or South America who took part in the building of the modern world system, becoming a navigator under European service. Later, the Portuguese João Lopes de Carvalho, the father of Ninito, became a prominent figure in Magellan's fleet, taking charge in different positions on the vessel, including running what had been left from Magellan's fleet in the east, where he lost his son. Thus, when the Victoria sailed from Tidore, one of the Molucca Islands, to Seville under the command of Elcano on December 21st, 1521, João Lopes de Carvalho stayed in Tidore according to Antonio Pigafetta's diary. Carvalho died on February 14, 1522, before the departure of Trinidad towards Spain through the Pacific on April 20, 1522, according to the travel itinerary at Genoese pilots. The stay of Magellan's expedition with indigenous in Rio de Janeiro for 2 weeks between December 13 and 27, 1519, resulted in different narratives from the seamen on board. One of the most important ones was written by the Italian adventurer Antonio Pigafetta, who had made the first anthropological description about the indigenous Tupinambás from the Guanabara Bay area. Pigafetta's vast view revealed the world the hardest maritime voyage, which produced also a crossing of culture and trade exchanges in the very beginning of modernity. Thus, after the Guanabara stage of the fleet, which would discover the way to navigate from the Atlantic to Pacific, the Rio de Janeiro Bay area entered definitely into the world's cartography. Magellan, however, reaching the waters of the Guanabara Bay, named the place Santa Lucia's Bay for having arrived on the Catholic Saints' Day, rather than using the toponym Rio de Janeiro, as the region had been known since Amerigo Vespucci's time. Nonetheless, the first historical reference of the toponym Rio de Janeiro is a nautical chart dated from 1513 by the Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis, which is at Topkapı Saray Museum in Istanbul, was based in the original information from the Portuguese navigators. The 16th century accounts about the stay of Magellan's expedition in Rio de Janeiro Bay Area were written by the participants of the voyage, such as Antonio Pigafetta, Francisco Albo, and the Genoese pilot identified as the Italian Leon Pancaldo. However, as the first circumnavigation had aroused great economic interest from the possibility to reach the Spice Islands, a great number of 16th century historians such as Antonio de Herrera and João de Barros managed to acquire detailed information about the voyage started by Ferdinand Magellan and completed by Juan Sebastian Elcano as commanders. There's also a varied correspondence, as the latter registered in 1523 by Maximilianus of Transylvania's Charles V's secretary. This document is the first one to announce the first voyage around the world. The expedition chronicler Antonio Pigafetta belonged to the line of the great Italian navigators from Marco Polo to Christopher Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci, who revealed the ways of the world integration. The description of Guanabara or Rio de Janeiro Bay by the pilots of Magellan's fleet, such as Francisco Albo and Antonio Pigafetta, was a very important fact foretelling the peaceful encounter with the Guanabara natives, showing the existence of an ideal world once dreamed by Pato and Thomas Moros. The main document of the state of Magellan's fleet in Rio de Janeiro is Antonio Pigafetta's diary. The land is very abundant, wrote the wise Italian man about Rio de Janeiro. But soon he changes the subject, reporting his view about the peaceful living between the European seamen and the Guanabara indigenous people. I quote, "At the bay, there are good people and a lot of them, and they go nude and exchange books, mirrors, and rattles for things to eat, and there's a lot of redwood," said Pigafetta in December 9, 1519. This made a great impression in Europe for the exchanging of goods between the Guanabara indigenous people and Magellan's crew, which enabled the existence of a cordiality crossing two different worlds, the world of Europeans and the world of the native Brazilians. Thus, according to José María Blanco Núñez, it can be affirmed that the stay in Guanabara Bay was the only true delightful part in the whole circumnavigation. After 2 weeks living in harmony with the natives, Magellan's fleet went back to their route towards Solis River or Rio de la Plata, the last region where the Portuguese and Spanish navigators had reached. At that time, the fleet sailing eastward would have beyond them the unknown South American coast. To start, they had in Patagonia the San Julian Bay Rebellion, where the Finisterre kept a strait which would unite the Atlantic to the unknown Pacific. This way, when Juan Sebastian Elcano completed the first voyage around the world, Rio de Janeiro had already belonged to the world history as the first port where the new Argonauts stepped on the Guanabara Bay warm sand beaches. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Naus. Can we hear from Dr. Paulo Diaz?
I guess we better go on and we let for discussion since he's going to speak Spanish.
So we proceed with the next speaker. Thank you. Thank you for sharing us that part of history which most of us might not have encountered yet. So for our next speaker, he will talk about the 3 levels of triangular trade in the Pacific in the years 1565 to 1634. He taught history and related courses in 8 institutions of higher learning, including Adolfo Ibanez University. He held 6 academic positions, including editorial committee of some magazines. He presented paper to 38 conferences about commerce and economics. He also published 16 books and or articles in books. He is also a prolific reviewer of 33 published articles. Early in life, he worked as ayudante de investigación or research assistant in many projects in Chile for a total of 29. Our next speaker is an indefatigable researcher and writer indeed. Please welcome Professor Dr. Jaime Alejandro Rosenblit Berdichevsky.
Good evening, good morning. Thank you, Dr. Salvania. Let me share my screen. Please excuse my horrible English. Although it has received much less attention than the Atlantic routes and the functioning of the formal exchange circuits, trade in Pacific during the Hispanic period has intrigued researchers who have glimpsed the importance of trade far and wide on its shores, but they have not been able to accurately measure what different observers point out, since this circulation was not recorded in the official records, and because it was preferably contraband, it was concealed or silenced by authorities and committed officers. The famous French historian Pierre Choni in the 1950s already suspected that behind the facade of the Manila galleon, which covered the Trans-Pacific route between Acapulco and Manila to allow the survival of the Spanish enclave in the Philippines, and thus radiate Christianity throughout Asia, and formidable smuggling was hidden that harmed the interests of civilian merchants by flooding the American Pacific with Asian fabrics and porcelains, and conspired against the global project of the Catholic monarchy by diverting an important part of American silver to China. Today, that history is so difficult to scrutinize and so complex to understand due to the variety of factors involved, and just recently we are beginning to know it thanks to the effort of and wisdom of researchers such as Mariano Bonialian, Fernando Iwasaki, Guillermina del Valle Pavón, Margarita Suárez, Ramiro Flores Guzmán, Ana Crespo Solana, Domingo Centenero de Arce, and Antonio Terraza, among others. Here is a summary of their contributions. A picture speaks 1,000 words. This photograph was taken on July 24 of this year in Santillana del Mar, a small tourist town near Santander in northern Spain. It is a village of Roman origin which gained some fame in the 17th century when former neighbors and their heirs began to return from America as rich men. The so-called Indianos built spacious two-floor houses which they adorned with shields of nobility and decorated with some valuable objects that they had brought from the New World. Currently, in souvenir shops, tourists are offered furniture, tapestries, jewelry, tableware from that time, and this type of Chinese porcelain. Perhaps the pieces of the photograph are fake, but even so they show that in the imaginary of the Spanish 17th century, among the valuable objects that could be brought from America were Chinese products, which shows that Asian manufacture reached the farthest corners of the Spanish Empire. To understand the meaning of triangular trade in the Pacific during the transition from the 16th to the 17th century, it's necessary first to describe the role that the monarchy of Philip II assigned to its American positions within the geopolitical priorities of the empire, which were to sustain its disputes, strategic and military, against the 17 Dutch provinces and England, which we know have religious origin, and also in the friction between long-term political and economic projects. In this context, the huge wealth in precious metals that the conquest of the New World made available to the Catholic monarchy should serve to finance the war effort against its enemies. As the control of this resource was not immediate, and it was impossible to transform gold and silver bars into warships, cannons, or paid the salary of the soldiers, the monarchy of Philip II, as well as that of his father, Charles V, or that his successors, resorted to merchants' loans by granting guarantees and privileges. Warranties on the treasures transported by the fleets arriving from America, and privilege to distribute in the New World essential products for the society's information, such as all kinds of manufactures, tools, wine, spirits, oil, etc. This closed exchange, which transited through the Atlantic Ocean between the European metropole and its American possessions, is known as the race of the Indies, colonial monopoly system of fleets and galleons, or simply as Atlantic system. The contribution from the Americas, basically in form of silver bars, left the Peruvian coast bound for Panama. There it continued by land to Portobelo, where it was shipped to Havana, Cuba, where it met with the fleet leaving Veracruz, which moved the mining production of New Spain, together to continue the trip to Seville. In the opposite direction, in that city of Andalusia, a group of Spanish, Genoese, German, and Flemish merchants at their base of operation, who sent manufactured products to America, such as fabrics, clothing, furniture, crockery, tools, liquors, and oil. This cargo, appropriately escorted by warships, reached the port of Veracruz and Portobelo, where it was acquired by Mexican and Peruvian merchants, who redistributed in their own markets, where they were in a position to obtain great advantage due to their position as wholesale distributors. Both categories of monopoly merchants settled in Seville and the viceregal capitals of Mexico and Peru corresponded to this privilege of being able to channel the flows of merchandise and precious metals, providing loans to the monarchy and colonial authorities, either to finance military campaigns to support the functioning of the bureaucracy, or to build infrastructure works necessary for the empire, such as fortresses, ports, roads, and public buildings. Along with this ideal design, the imperial planners had to incorporate the Trans-Pacific route to Acapulco, from Acapulco to Manila, after Miguel González de Legazpi managed to successfully complete the round-trip navigation between Mexico and the Philippine archipelago in 1565. Initially, the interest of Philip II was to create in Manila an irradiating focus of Christianity in Asia, for which the settlers who arrived from Mexico could trade with different American possessions, exchanging different Asian products that they could access from the newly founded port of Manila, like the precious spices from India, Java, and Sumatra, or the silk and porcelain from China. In exchange, they could distribute American products such as corn, cocoa, sugar, and tobacco, but especially silver, which at the time was produced in abundance by the Cerro Rico de Potosí in the Viceroyalty of Peru. This flow of exchange was formalized in 1573 with the creation of a fleet that regularly covered the Manila-Acapulco route. But this trade between Spanish colonies on both Pacific shores began to deteriorate the situation of the Atlantic system and of those who had entrusted the success of their business to the ability of the Catholic monarchy to impose its authority. The cheaper Chinese manufacturers easily displaced the same products of European origin from the American markets, and the silver of the new war, which had to fill the coffers of the crown and the civilian merchants who financed it, left in large quantities across the Pacific and ended in China. Interested in maintaining the boost to the economies on Mexico and the Philippines, but also in protecting the interests of merchants of Seville, as well as their own silver income, which supported their foreign policy. In April 1579, the Spanish crown tried to regulate trade in the Pacific by confirming the operation of the Manila galleon between Manila and Acapulco and the Acapulco and Callao route, but reducing the size of the ships, the volume of silver, and the amount of manufactured products that could be taken from one market to another. This design, based on navigation and interchange between Manila, Acapulco, and El Callao, obeys the name triangular trade. As can be seen in the image, out of this circulation was Panama-Portobelo axis, and with it, the entire Atlantic system around which the Catholic monarchy had organized its empire and on which its alternatives rested to warranty credits to finance its foreign policy. Therefore, the triangular trade meant a serious contradiction between the strategic objectives of the Catholic monarchy, since maintaining an enclave in the Philippines through a flow of exchange with New Spain meant damaging the interests of the merchant engaged in the Atlantic route, as well as of the income it received directly from silver production in America. Certainly, the attempt to limit trade in the Pacific was unsuccessful, and many merchants in Lima and Mexico took advantage of the inability of the Crown to enforce its mandates to flood the American markets with Oriental manufactures and divert an important part of the Peruvian silver production to Manila, as the circulation was carried out in form of smuggling. It was not registered in the official counts, so it's impossible to know its true size. We know of its importance from the testimonies left by contemporary observers and chroniclers. Recently, some specialists have calculated that the illicit trade in the Pacific was equivalent to approximately 40% of the legal trade in the Atlantic system. A flow of this size could not have been the work of isolated traffickers or criminals who committed a crime and then went into hiding to enjoy their loot. On the contrary, it was the result of planned initiatives in which the main merchants of Peru and Mexico participated and had the complicity of the highest authorities of those viceroyalties, who, in addition to reinterpreting the king's orders at their will, often got involved directly in illicit trade operations. So, a first level in which it is necessary to stop is in the most important merchants of Peru and New Spain. Despite their monopolistic position in America, the merchants of Lima and Mexico, as well as the guilds that represented them and through which they transformed their economic power into political influence, had good reasons to challenge the mandates of the crown and continue to tolerate triangular trade by reinterpreting the king orders. In the case of Mexico, its geographical location between the Atlantic and the Pacific gave it the opportunity to become the commercial core of the empire, since it could articulate the distribution of lower-cost manufactures at the same time that it enjoyed an easy access to the main producing sources of precious metals in America, which facilitated the transformation of trade surpluses into solid metal. Meanwhile, the great Peruvian space of the 16th century could be considered an autarkic economy. Its territory housed the main mineral reserves known at the time, produced all kinds of food, wine, wool, and vegetable fibers, and had numerous small workshops or obrajes where the clothes that most of the production of the population were made. It only had to import the luxury products consumed by more affluent segment of society. Therefore, his subordination to the Atlantic system represented more of a cost than a benefit, and an obstacle if this colonial power decided to follow his own path to achieve greater power and wealth. Everything seems to indicate that the attempt to the authorities to regulate and limit the triangular trade were useless, and especially to stop the spillage of Peruvian silver towards China, since in June 1582, it prohibited trade between Acapulco and Peruvian ports. Of course, this measure did not succeed in eliminating what we could call natural exchange flows or natural action of the markets, since trade in the Pacific between Mexico and Peru continued to operate by restoring to intermediate ports in Central and South America. The null effectiveness of this measure forced an attempt to limit the traffic carried by Manila galleon in January 1593, with a maximum of 250,000 pesos in merchandise that could be taken from Manila to Acapulco, and 5,000 in the opposite direction. In other words, the difference was precisely the amount of silver that was authorized to export. The ports of Peru, Guatemala, and Panama, that is Central America, were excluded from this traffic. Trade between Peru and Mexico was reduced to 3 ships a year between 300 and 400 tons, which could only carry locally produced goods. But not everyone among the Spanish authorities thought that the correct path was to restrict triangular trade. On the contrary, to allow it subject it to taxation and thus ensure the part of its profits were for the benefit of the crown. The main promoter of this policy was Francisco Valverde de Mercado, Viceroy of New Spain between 1603 and 1607, and of Peru between 1607 and 1615. Those who did not think alike accused him of being directly linked to illicit trade and being at the service of the great merchant from Mexico and Lima. If we give him the benefit of the doubt, we can consider Valverde an early exponent of liberal economic thought in the style of Jean-Baptiste Sayce or Adam Smith, considering that tax collection grows as exchange increases, while higher tax taxes and restrictions, they only stimulate smuggling and hoard public revenues. On many occasions, especially in New Spain, the financial emergencies of the colonial administration were the best ally of the trans-Pacific trade, since the need to obtain resources quickly to pay salaries, arm fleets, and build fortresses forced the authorities to tolerate and even encourage this exchange. In front of and beyond the imperial planners, concerned about the negative effects of the triangular trade on the royal treasury, were the merchants of Seville, who watched with alarm as the triangular trade undermined their privilege and investments in Atlantic route, and how the Peruvian agents, the peruleros, took away their prominence in the main markets of America and Europe. In 1607, the Seville Consulate, that is the Guild of the main merchants, proposed to the crown to create a direct route from Seville to Manila through Cape Horn, which would take care of obtaining Chinese manufactures and then distribute them in America from the Portobello Fair, in the same way that it did with European manufacturers. The initiative, which was later seriously considered, alerted American businessmen involved in triangular trade, not to unattend that the interests of the crown were completely neglected, since the most humble population of the continent should feel that they were the main beneficiaries of this exchange, since it was the only way to access manufactured goods at low prices. Meanwhile, the triangular trade continued to function, and restrictions failed to reduce its volume. Contemporary observers estimated that between 1611 and 1620, an annual average of 5 million pesos in silver left from Acapulco to Manila, demonstrating the futility of the measures adopted to avoid it. In this way, in 1620, King Philip III decided to reduce again the traffic between Acapulco and El Callao to 2 ships of 200 tons per year, and to assign a significant number of officers exclusively dedicated to fighting smuggling. This also did not deliver the expected results. So, on January 23 of 1634, the Catholic monarch prohibited the navigation between Peru and Mexico, putting an end to triangular trade. From this final point of the triangular trade in the Pacific, it is shocking that neither Peruvian nor Mexican traders have resorted to their influence to try to reverse or moderate the decision, or persist in smuggling to continue making profits from Asian trade. In the case of Peruvian merchants, the most reasonable explanation is offered by Ramiro Flores and Margarita Suarez. Flores draws attention to the fact that the main fortunes of the viceroyalty had been built from illicit trade, allowing them to lead the distribution of imports in South America. The end of the triangular trade circuit meant preventing new players entering the business following the same path, while they concentrated their attention and capital on the Atlantic roads. Another favorable factor for the Peruvian merchants was that once the Mexican connection disappeared, they managed to control the flow of silver and quicksilver and began to accumulate an important volume of capital with which they were present in important European places under Spanish influence, such as Seville, Vizcaya, Lisbon, Genoa, and Milan, and to give a dominant position in trade flows within the empire, even outside the system centered on Portobello Fair. In the event of political conflicts or economic crisis, they had the alternative of taking refuge in the domestic market to wait for better times. Meanwhile, Mexican merchants, much more affected by the end of the triangular trade, had the opportunity to continue violating the prohibitions, resorting to the special licenses granted by the crown when it needed to make important military expenses, and even go so far as to re-export Chinese products to Europe, claiming high accumulation of unsold merchandise. The Asian politics of the Catholic monarchy is a key factor in analyzing the history of triangular trade in the Pacific. So it is necessary to begin by pointing out that when sending the expedition of Hernando de Magallanes in 1519 and Jofre de Loaiza in 1525 towards the Molucca, the intention of the monarchy of Charles V was to take possession of the spice producing islands, which he considered within of his hemisphere according to the agreement with Portugal in the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494. This should turn Castile into a gravitating economic power in Europe and provide it with the necessary resources to finance its fight against the states that adjoined the reform of Martin Luther and against the Islamic empires of the Middle East. The difficulties of navigation to the Far East by the route of the Strait of Magellan, the already consolidated presence of Portugal in the Moluccas, the need to face the uprising of several communes in the interior of Spain, and even the administrative and financial problems of the empire forced Charles V to negotiate an agreement with Portugal, taking advantage of having married Isabel, heir to that kingdom. Through the Zaragoza Treaty in 1535, Spain sold its rights to Moluccas to Portugal for 350,000 ducats, approximately 1 ton of silver. The union of both crowns in 1580, during the reign of Philip II, seemed to satisfy the Spanish objectives, but the Castilian monarch promised to respect the integrity of the Portuguese possessions, so that the spice trade continued under the control of the Portuguese factories in Malacca, an enclave to which the Spanish accessed from Manila, and therefore from the Pacific route. But the real problems of the Catholic monarchy were not that the Spanish and Portuguese commerce operated independently of each other. One of these problems
Rosa, you lost your sound. We cannot hear you. No, no, not yet. No, we cannot hear you. No hay sonido.
And now?
Ay, ya está bien.
Yes?
It's okay.
All right. All right. All right. I follow him. I will show the roots of some British roots in war to reach Asia. This is Dutch. Another was the Genoese merchants. The finances of the Catholic monarchy made their influence felt both to eliminate the damage that the triangular trade of the Pacific had on their interests on the Atlantic route and to enter directly into Asian trade. This was a strategic objective of Genoa, since in its old dispute with the Republic of Venice, it had lost space in the competition for control of spice market in Europe. As a result of a skillful Venetian diplomacy, achieving, in part, restored the ancient trade routes between Asia and Mediterranean after the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453 through the capital of the Ottoman Empire. That is why the Genoese merchant living in Spain, along with all the merchants involved in the Atlantic monopoly system, pressured the Catholic monarchy to establish a direct navigation route between Seville and Manila. In 1624, Philip III tried to meet the demands of the merchants unionized in the powerful consulate of Seville, together with the
Dr. Rosenblatt, we lost your connection. You have no sound. You're muted. We don't hear any.
Can you hear me?
Ahora sí. Muy
Ahora
bien.
sí. All right, I want to end.
Okay.
The definitive elimination of triangular trade in 1634 with the prohibition of navigation between Acapulco and Peru was not a victory for the Catholic monarchy, but quite the opposite. Faced with the inability to integrate a dynamic and prosperous trade networks into the structure of the empire, Philip III resorted to a measure of force, which was only accepted by the merchants of Mexico and Lima and Manila, because they were in a position to continue their business in elsewhere routes and other markets, because the decision protected them from the appearance of new competitors, and because finally they had managed to impose the idea among the most powerful subjects of the empire related to their lord. It is vague, but it's not fulfilled. Finally, trade between Europe and Asia was already a reality, in which the Spanish Empire had decided to stop participating, leaving an empty space that its enemies soon occupied. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rosenblit. Despite our technical problems, we're able to manage. Ha sido un poco larga, pero me pareció un poco corta todavía, considering that the Pacific is very wide and that the triangular trade is so vast. I wish we could have more time with you, so we could really have the details of the whole triangular trade. Anyway, thank you very much. Salamat po.
Gracias.
Okay, so our next speaker will, he's already here. He's just on the waiting. Our next speaker will talk on the unlikely contacts between Southeast Asia and the South America, Argentine and Philippine relations during the 17th and early 19th centuries. He graduated from the School of Oriental Studies of El Salvador University, where he teaches courses on contemporary history of Asia Pacific with a focus on Southeast Asia. He is the coordinator of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, as well as the Secretary of the Department of Asia and the Pacific of the Institute of International Relations of the National University of La Plata. He is also a member of the Board of Directors of the Argentina branch of the Latin American Association of Asian and African Studies and member of the editorial board of the journal Asia America Latina of the Group for Asia and Latin American Studies of the Institute for Latin American and the Caribbean Studies of the University of Buenos Aires. At present, he is the president of the Argentine-Philippine Cultural Institute. Damas y caballeros, el profesor Ezequiel Ramoneda.
Good morning, good evening, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm the Quincentennial Committee, the Philippine Academic Consortium for Latin American Studies, and of course the Department of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines for this invitation. It's good to see old friends, Professor Silvania, Professor Camacho, Professor Cialcita. Well, I will enter into my presentation. Thank you very much, Professor Rosa. In fact, I will use a lot of your information, so just to probably to some issues. Basically, my idea is to browse very fast about the relations between the Argentina and the Philippines during the colonial period There we go. Basically, the Argentina and the Philippines relations during the colonial period, I would try to frame it between the early 16th century to the early 19th century. First of all, I will just brief about the Magellan expedition in Argentine territory. It's one of the more difficult parts of this expedition, as it faced the hardship of the winter season down the south of Argentina, where he also suffered the wreck of ship Santiago in May 1520, and the desert of the crew of ship Santiago San Antonio in early November 1520. He spent almost 4 months in Port San Julian and a month and a half in Port Santa Cruz. This is in Santa Cruz province in Argentina, really down the south, really close to Antarctica. So he almost spent 10 months in Argentina, give and take, and probably one of the hardest seasons. It was eventually, well, a lot of issues going on in Argentina about, of course, the visitation. But actually, it was in early November where he found or he discovered the Oceanic Channel, also known as Strait of Magellan, where it was possible to link the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, reaching eventually Philippines four months later in early March 1521. It's more or less, the general trip voyage of Magellan. This is, the hardest part down the south of Argentina, where he made the stop. It was in early November when he actually discovered the Strait of Magellan. Now, my idea is to frame the Argentine-Philippines relations. Actually, as what I mentioned, is the Spanish author in Latin America and the Pacific Rim. This is not exactly, the history of the Spanish crown or Spanish colonies all over the world, because actually Spain was had colonies in Latin America after the early 19th century. I want to frame it as the Spanish order. Basically, I frame it between the year 1929 to the year 1810, so more or less, give and take 200 years, 250 years, where the Spanish crown was the hegemonic power and established its colonial rule over most of part of the American continent and the Pacific Ocean rim, plus, of course, the Philippine archipelago. Of course, it's not possible to say properly that there were bilateral relations between Argentina and the Philippines, because actually neither of these countries existed during the colonial period, but it's quite possible to mention there were links between the Argentine territory and the Philippine territory, even though they were the farthest area within the Spanish Empire, as they were under the colonial rule of the Spanish crown, and there were links, different links I will mention right afterwards, between these two territories. Of course, it's general common knowledge that thanks to the Spanish crown, to the Spanish Empire, in Latin America, in the Philippines, there was spread of the Spanish culture, the Spanish language, the Catholic ground of Christianity. These are one of the common elements we share between the Philippines and Argentina and most of the Latin American countries. This Spanish order that goes from the 1530 to the 1810, basically it can be divided into two main periods. One, it goes from the 1930 to 13, where mainly when the Spanish crown was under the Habsburg dynasty. It carried the administrative organization of the empire, establishment the Viceroyalty of New Spain, Mexico, by 1535, and by the Viceroyalty of Peru in South America in 1542. Of course, the establishment of the Manila Galleon, becoming the main trade route linking Philippines in East Asia and Spain in the Western Europe through Mexico in North America. Here, I take a lot of the presentation of Professor Jaime Rosenblatt. Actually, this was the main route, probably in the second part of the 16th century. There was officially trade relations between Manila and Peru, but in the early 1770s, that was from the 1604, 1605, and then, of course, 1630, this trade was abolished, where, of course, there was a formal political and economic subordination of Peru and Acapulco, Calcasieu trade route towards Mexico. And that doesn't mean that there were no trade relations, but there was a lot of illegal trade. That's a lot of Professor Jaime just mentioned before in his presentation. Of course, the main goods were spices from Southeast Asia, porcelain, silk, and other products from China, and other products from goods from Japan. And they were exchanged in Acapulco and, of course, here in El Callao, in Lima, Peru, mainly shaped by for silver obtained in Mexico and Peru. And here I have to also include Bolivia. That was the main mining activities here in South America. This is more or less the idea of the Spanish Order in the Latin America and the Pacific Rim. Almost all Latin America, except some part of the actual Brazil territory, and most of the Pacific Rim, including, of course, the Philippine Archipelago, the Marianas Archipelagos, and part of other islands in the Pacific. Usually back then, in the 17th century, the Pacific Ocean was known also as the Lao Indiano or Lao Español, because, of course, as I mentioned before, Spain was the hegemonic power. This is an idea of what was the viceroyalty of Peru in the mid-17th century. As I mentioned, almost all the South American territory was under the Spanish crown, except a few territory in the Brazil facing the Atlantic Ocean. This is, of course, one of the main trade, as I mentioned before, the main trade links. Of course, the Galeon de Manila, that's the most well-known. And then we have the links between Veracruz and, Spain, of course, Cadiz, the Southern group. But actually, as I mentioned before, and as Professor Harry also mentioned, there were a trade relation through the Pacific mainly between Acapulco and Lima, what Peru is known as El Callao. And most of that part was like inter-regional Latin American trade, where only goods from Latin America and only European were allowed it, not Asian goods, specifically silk, and of course it was not allowed officially. The exchanges for silver. And nevertheless, as I mentioned, there was allowed illegal activities going on. The second period can go from the early 18th century to 1810. Back then, the Spanish crown was under the Bourbon dynasty as a result of the War of the Spanish Succession and the signing of the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. Carry out new administrative reform of the empire. The Viceroyalty of Peru was divided in 1776, creating the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, of River Plate. Also in 1777, a year later, the signing of the Treaty of San Ildefonso between the Spanish crown and the Portuguese crown was signed, establishing the frontiers between the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire in South America. And this is quite important also because it shows the increase of importance, because usually, the Manila Galleon is framed between the Trans-Pacific relations and their connections with Western Europe. But from the mid-18th century onwards, new and enhanced relations were taking place in the Atlantic. They were called the transatlantic relations within the empire, the Spanish Empire. And among them, one of the key initiatives was the creation of the Royal Company of the Philippines in the year 1785. It was a trading company, of course, under the control of the Spanish crown, having depots, of course, in the Philippines, but in China, in Canton, in Guangzhou, in India, in Calcutta, then in Africa, in the Atlantic, in the Atlantic coast of in Africa. Of course, they have the main center in Spain, but also in Latin America, specifically in South America, in Uruguay and Argentina. I will mention this in a brief moment. These are, just speaking these routes from the transatlantic routes, connecting Philippines, China, India, Africa, Spain, and South America, not through the Manila Galleon. This is general idea for youth that have an understanding of the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. It's most of the part. What territories became part of the Viceroyalty? Of course, right now what we call Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. The silver deposit, the silver mining activities of Bolivia changed hands. They were no longer under the rule of Peru, but became part of Argentina on the head of the government of Viceroyalty in Buenos Aires. And then the end of the Spanish order, there are different facts, there are different areas, but generally speaking, we can go from the early 1780s to the 1810s, when we have the Treaty of Aranjuez between Spain and France. From then on, Spain declared the war on England and supported the rebel colonies in North America. Of course, England responded, and the Japan responded, and hampering the maritime trade between the metropolis, the Spanish metropolis, and its colonies in America. We have, this is really important, the incident of Bay of Nootka Sound. This is in the Pacific coast of Canada right now, in the British Columbia province. Back then, it was formally, legally, the end of this Spanish order, because thanks to the Treaty of San Lorenzo el Real, the limits of their influence between the Spanish Empire and English Empire in the Pacific were established. Then, of course, we have Napoleon Bonaparte occupation of the Peninsula Iberica, of Spain and Portugal, and the defeat of the Spanish and French fleet in the Battle of Trafalgar, and eventually, and this, probably this is the last sensitive event, is the abdication of the kings of Spain, King Carlos IV and Fernando VII, abdicating to the throne. This eventually unleashed the independence movement in Latin America, becoming the end, of course, of the Spanish rule in Latin America, and eventually the end of the trade relations, or the trade routes between, Manila Galleon in the north and the Royal Company of the Philippines and the south. This is generally speaking.
Pardon, Professor Ramodera. Yes? Your slides are not changing. Se olvidó en mover la slides, o tiene solamente una. Your PowerPoint is not changing. It's only one page.
I will try to share again. Are you seeing another slide?
No, es la misma.
Do you see me changing the slides right now?
Página 3.
Here it says that the shared screen is in pause. I don't know.
It's not changing.
Why don't you make it full screen?
Okay, wait a second.
Full screen. There. Oops.
I'll go again.
Okay.
Are you seeing there the PPT presentation?
Please full screen it.
Okay. Right now it's okay.
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's still the same slide.
It seems that when I go full screen, the sharing screen gets on pause. So I'm not allowed to share the.
Oh.
Do you see me changing right now?
Ahora sí, se ha cambiado.
Okay, well, I will do it like this way. Sorry, it seems
okay.
I'm having a problem because when I go full screen, the sharing screen gets on pause, so I'm not allowed to share. I don't know why. Oh, just speaking on.
Vale.
This I went on. I will just not repeat the same information, but only show you the maps. This is the Trans-Pacific links of the Manila Galleon, and of course the Trans-Pacific between Veracruz and Spain, Cadiz. These are the south between the Royal Company of the Philippines, going from China, India, Africa, and South America. And this, of course, the idea of the viceroyalty, it was the last slide, the idea of the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, including, of course, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. Now, between this context of the Spanish rule in Latin America and the Pacific Rim from 1530 to 1810, my idea is to frame, to understand the relations between the Argentine territory and the Philippines territory. During the first part, we can say from the 1560s, from the establishment of the Manila Galleon till the mid-18th century, 1560s onwards, the main trade relations were through Manila Galleon. Back then, of course, it was Manila, Acapulco, and from Acapulco went down the south to Lima as the capital city of the Viceroyalty of Peru. This was the main center in South America for the redistribution of foreign goods, foreign products, including those from Asia. From the port of El Callao, Lima, trade penetrated into the hinterland of actually Peru and Bolivia, and far beyond the South American territory by multiple land routes, and that's really important. Passing through the city of Potosí, this is Bolivia, trade route reached the main economic centers in Argentine territory back then, such as the city of Salta, Tucumán, Córdoba, and eventually Buenos Aires. This is an idea of this land route connecting Lima to the rest of the Viceroyalty of Peru, mainly what is right now the Bolivian territories and Paraguay territories and Argentine territories. Back then, during this season, during the 17th century and the first half of the 18th century, Buenos Aires was like a peripheral city. It was not back then the most important economic center of the Viceroyalty. A lot of illegal activities were going on in Buenos Aires, but it was not the most important. Actually, Córdoba or Tucumán or Salta were more important back then than Buenos Aires. As Professor Jaime mentioned before, how these trade relations involving Philippines and Argentine territories back then. This is a letter sent from Fray Martín Ignacio de Loyola to the King Philip IV, King of Spain, in 1605, mentioning about the important penetration of Chinese fabrics, especially silks, in Argentine territory and the economic damage they were generating. So we have early 17th century, one part of this trade reaching Argentine territories, from Manila towards Acapulco, then from Acapulco to Lima, El Callao, then from Callao, going through Bolivia, north of Argentina, and eventually reaching Argentina. So you have an idea so far in the early 17th century how developed this trade between not only the Trans-Pacific maritime trade, but also the land trade between all these hinterland internal cities within the Viceroyalty of Peru. On the contrary, this is a section of the Giovanni Francesco Chevelli Carrieri. He was an Italian traveler that in the late 17th century, he was in Acapulco. And over there, in his journal, he stated that he was invited by a captain over there, Yerba Mate del Paraguay. Back then, of course, as I mentioned before, Paraguay was part of the Argentine territory, and of course, the part of Argentine territory would actually produce yerba mate. So it could be possible that we're facing the first good from, the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, of north of Argentina, south of Paraguay, that actually reached Acapulco, and it's possible to think that actually could have reached and shipped to Manila. This is probably, this is an hypothesis, but we're facing the first good from South America, mainly, from the Viceroyalty of the Territory of Argentina, part of the Viceroyalty of Peru, that actually reach Manila and eventually East Asia, with yerba mate. And then, but of course, regarding cultural links, so far it was, according to my research, it was not possible to find during this period the presence of Filipinos or Argentinians in the mentioned territories, but actually, and this is important, there were not only trade relations, but also cultural relations through the networks of many of the different religious orders that were a part of Christianity. In this case, I took especially one that is the order of the preachers, also known as Order of the Dominicans or Dominicanos, or the Order of Santo Domingo. It was founded in the year 1215 in France by a Spanish friar known as Santo Domingo de Guzman, also known as Santo Domingo, and it was approved in the year 1216 by the Pope Honorius III. They reached, the Dominican order reached America in 1510, reaching Santo Domingo. Among their first achievement was the establishment in the year 1538 of the higher education institution, the first higher education institution in America, the University of Santo Domingo, Santo Tomas, in actually what is known right now as the Dominican Republic. But it also reached, in the case, they eventually reached the Viceroyalty of Peru in the year 1540, and eventually they reached Dutch territory in early 1550. Back then, they began establishing convent in Santiago del Estero, Córdoba, and Tucumán in the early 17th century. But also the Dominicans reached Philippines through Mexico, eventually in the year 1581. By the year 1588, they founded the first convent in Manila. They followed by another in the island of Luzon, and eventually among their first achievements was the establishment in the year 1611 of the first higher education institution, not only in the Philippines, but on Asian soil was that University of Santo Tomas. And why this is important? Because they were a network functioning of the Dominican order. All these convents around the Spanish Empire, they were connecting one another and of course connecting their territories. And it's important, for instance, this is mentioning about Spanish friar Juan Manuel Mercadillo Patiño, who professed in San Esteban Convent in Salamanca, in Spain, in the year 1659. He was assigned to the Philippines in the year 1666, where he taught philosophy and theology at the University of Santo Tomas, becoming also its dean. Then in the year 1681, he returned to Spain, and finally in the year 1640 and 94, he was appointed as Bishop of Córdoba, Buenos Aires, the Argentine territory, but he eventually arrived to Córdoba in December 1698. Do you see all these religious persons declared going around the Spanish Empire, moving along this network of convents? And this will be really important in the next period, and I will show you then why. Well, Argentine Philippine relations in the second period, basically we can frame them between the second part of the 18th century and early 1810. Of course, the influence of the Manila Galleon as the main link between Asia and America lasts until the 1760s, with the establishment of the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata in Buenos Aires, became the capital city of the new Viceroyalty and one of the connecting centers in South America. There was a reorientation of the trade axis. And no more, there was a trade relation between Lima. Now the goods began to enter through the port of Buenos Aires. This is the new orientation towards the Pacific, towards the Atlantic, sorry. And it was from Buenos Aires that trade penetrated into the hinterland of Buenos Aires, Rio de la Plata, and far beyond the South America. Now it goes through Buenos Aires to Santa Fe, Córdoba, Tucumán, Salta, and eventually Bolivia. So the trade relations within South America territory were inverted. They were not Lima, Bolivia, Salta, Tucumán, Córdoba. Right now it's Buenos Aires, Santa Fe, Córdoba, Tucumán, and eventually Bolivia. This, of course, shows the different orientation of the trade relations between South America, Spain, and the rest of the colonies of the Spanish Empire. Actually, the Royal Company of the Philippines has a depot in Montevideo and in Buenos Aires City. In Buenos Aires City, for those who know, was in current Lezama Park in Buenos Aires City, established in the year 1789. That was when this depot of the Royal Company of the Philippines was built. Back then, the main trade relations, of course, they were still rich in silk, but as mentioned before, the Philippines had different depots in China, India, Africa, and eventually, of course, Argentina, South America. The main goods were not actually rather Asian, but actually the main goods traded was slaves. Because the return of Africa and South American relations, and of course, the other productions, both agriculture and cattle growing. Most of the main good back then, sorry to put it this way, was slaves going through Buenos Aires towards the mining activities in Bolivia. Then cultural links. As of course, there was an economic development and projection towards the Atlantic Ocean of the Rio de la Plata region, it became more attractive towards foreigners, including those from Asia. And here we can find probably one of the first, I know it will be the first one, but it's possible to identify in official documents, Esteban Luis Mateo Samson. He was a Philippine sculptor, born in Philippines, in Malabon, in the year 1766, and then in Buenos Aires in the year 1813. He was characterized as Indian from China, was Indianizados. So it's important to, when checking about them in the archives, to check about this term. They don't appear as Philippines, but they have this double crossword between, they were not only Indians, making reference to the autochthonous peoples of America, but also of China coming from abroad. It probably came through the trade route linking Manila with Buenos Aires by the Manila Galleon. By the year 1780, he was already in Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata. He was a sculptor of sacred images. His artistic style combined elements of Spanish imaginary with aspects of Philippine Oriental art. His most renowned sculptures are found in convents of the Dominican order in the cities of Córdoba and Buenos Aires. Actually, and this is the importance of these orders, actually, when he reached out to Argentina, he went to mainly to this order because it was possible their familiarities, their relations between the Philippines and Argentina, found that here in Argentina, making it easier for him to stay and to, of course, find a living, find a job to providing them with images. This is two of them, of the most renowned, Santo Domingo Penitente. This is in the convent of Santo Domingo, the city of Buenos Aires. And the other one is Señor de la Humildad y la Paciencia, a lot of humility and patience, in the church of Nuestra Señora de la Merced. This is in the province of Buenos Aires. But besides Samson, there are other Filipinos identified, such as Andrés de la Cruz, he's a hairdresser, and López Vizcarra, a doctor. He was living in Montevideo. And actually, in the census of the city of Buenos Aires, carried out in the year 1855, in that census, they mentioned at least 13 Filipinos living in Buenos Aires city. In that census, one of the agents is the years they have been living in the country. Taking that because that fact, it could be possible to trace back then to these Filipinos the early 1810. So to give you an idea, I mean, in the early 19th century, there are a lot. I mean, so far I was able to identify around 10 to 15 Filipinos living in the Buenos Aires city in the early 19th century. But it's important that they reach over here, not only through the Manila Galleon route, but also through the transatlantic route. The oldest one, and this is important, Lorenzo Carneiro, he's from the Philippines. He's a landowner. So you have an idea of the importance he had back then in the society of Buenos Aires city. He married Juliana Gutierrez, 40 years old, and he had 3 daughters. And this is actually a copy of the census. I don't know if it was possible to see it over there, but here actually he mentioned here and mentioned how long he has been living in Argentina, or back then the United Province of Rio de la Plata. He actually thinks that he reached here by the early decade of the 1810s. But from the other way onward, what Argentinians were in the Philippines during this time? Probably the most renowned is the brother of Jose San Martin, our national hero, Juan Fermín. But actually, I don't consider him as an Argentinian, even though he has blood related with Jose San Martin, because he didn't actually came to Argentina. He spent all his life in Spain and later went to the Philippines. And actually, if you think it, probably has a different political orientation than his brother. But still, related with San Martin is his brother-in-law. The wife of José San Martín, María de los Remedios de Escalada, has a stepbrother, Bernabé Antonio de Escalada, born in the year 1780, died in the year 1857, who lived sometime in the Philippines. He entered the Royal Treasury of the Philippines in the year 1807 as an official archivist. Between the year 1810 and to 1818, he held the position of the first officer, becoming between 1818 and 1821 an Indian minister accountant first and a minister treasurer second. He returned to Argentina in the year 1821 when his father died. Actually, this could be one of the first Argentinians that actually spent some time living in the Philippines. And like over here, they have a statement of the Sociedad Real Económica de Filipinas, the name of del país. It was a Spanish institution where he mentioned, the presence of Bernabé Escalada. Just speaking about the conclusions. During the late 16th century to the mid 18th centuries, there were interlinks between Argentine and Philippine territories through the Pacific Ocean by means of the trade routes linking Manila to Acapulco and then to El Callao, Peru. During the second part of the 18th century, owing to the greater economic importance of the Rio de la Plata region, the establishment of the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata with Buenos Aires as the capital city, followed by the international weakness of the Spanish crown, and enhanced link through the Atlantic Ocean thanks to the creation of the Royal Company of the Philippines, relations between Argentine and Philippine territories were more diversified. Now, what's the issue? Owing to the new Atlantic orientation, it's possible to say that a bias emerged regarding the understanding of Argentina and Philippines, and the Philippines, I mentioned Philippines, of course, it's Asian countries. First, of course, a geographical bias. Geographical distance became a barrier. Now we think about we have the Andes, we have the Pacific Ocean, how it was possible that were links between Argentina and the Philippines. And then, of course, the importance of what this was in the early, from the mid-20th century onwards, since the establishment of diplomatic relations, the importance of intergovernmental relations concealed the role of other actors. Because if you think about the colonial period, actually, as I mentioned before at the beginning of this presentation, neither Argentina nor Philippines existed as a free country, as an independent country. So what type of relations were among these two territories? It's actually this second bias considered the role of other actors, religious orders, trading companies, private entrepreneurs. It is important to rethink and to rediscover the colonial links between Argentina and other South American countries, those mainly facing the Atlantic Ocean and East Asia during the colonial period. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramoneda. It's good to know that we have blood ties with your people there. Let me see. Can we have a copy of the presentation of all speakers? Well, that can be answered by the DFA. Do we have time? Do we have anybody from DFA? Do we have time for the open forum? It's now son las 10 de la noche. We are overshooting our time. Anybody from DFA? How do we go on with this? We still have the closing remarks from Dr. Shialzita. Okay, so let's...
Maybe we can entertain one or two questions.
Actually, there's only one question here, Dr. Llanes. So the question is, what is the role of Madre España with regards to control of these trading connections? Perhaps this will go to Dr. Naus. What is the role of Madre Spain with regards to control of these trading connections and the generating process if it is disadvantageous for Spain? Did you get the question, Dr. Naus?
Could you repeat it? Could you repeat it, please?
Okay, what is the role of Spain with regards to the control of these trading connections and the generating process if it is disadvantageous for Spain?
I'm not sure if I get the question, but in our case, we were talking about what in our days we call it currently Brazil. So it was part of the Portuguese America, the Portuguese territory that at that time was not already really occupied by the colonial project. What is maybe important to say is that um, the the time of the Magellan fleet is a time where Portugal and Spain tried to organize their control over the seas. But at the end of the 16th century, after 1580, we have a time of Iberian Union, where Philip II he got at the same time the crown of Spain and the crown of Portugal. So there's a period of integration of Spanish trade and Portuguese trade in the South Atlantic. Although the connection with the East changed the route after discovery of the Mexican way to the east. So the South Atlantic did not participate directly into this East-West exchange. And as my Argentinian colleague showed very clearly, the Rio de la Plata became the connection between the trade between the South Atlantic and the East trade. So I don't know if I answered clearly the question, but what I wanted to stress is this idea that in the case of the Brazilian area, there is the question of the connection between or the relationship between Portugal and Spain. And this changes along the time. So if Magellan, at the time of Magellan, Spain and Portugal, they were kind of partners over the policy over the seas. After the end, at the end of the 16th century, Portugal and Spain became under the same king. What changed a lot, the policy about the seas during this time. And then in different periods, as Spain and after the end of the second half of the 17th century, Portugal and Spain, they separated again their dynasties. So there was another period, and at this moment, the Rio de la Plata way became very important for this East-West trade.
Thank you very much. Está muy claro. Okay. Dr. Shercita is raising his hand.
Yeah. I have a question to address to Dr. Yvette Camacho. I'm curious because, you know, I was really surprised to know that actually there are attempts to control bride service and bride wealth on the other side of the Atlantic. First of all, I want to point out why the status of women has relatively been high in Southeast Asia. It's because of the descent system. Both sons and daughters in Southeast Asia inherit property traditionally. So that gives women a certain degree of independence. Now I was wondering about the system among the Maya. Have you come across any information as to how the descent and inheritance system would be like among the Maya? Because you mentioned the Maya of Guatemala.
From what I read, the women, they did not. They also inherited, but I don't remember now if it's like egalitarian. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like if it's the same for both men and women. Yes.
Yeah, I think in your study you should bring out the fact that the status of women in Southeast Asia compared to that of women in China and India.
Yes.
It's relatively, I would say relatively, and not completely, relatively equal, is because of the inheritance pattern, the descent system, what we in anthropology would call bilateral descent. Because in China it's patrilineal, it's only the sons who inherit. Yeah.
Yes.
Same to in India.
Mhm. Okay, thank you for that point.
Thank you for your paper. That's very anthropological.
Okay, so thank you very much. Does Dr. Rosenblit have something to do with the first question? Or is Dr. Rosenblit?
La que viene acá en el... ¿Me la puede decir en castellano, en español?
Sí, señor.
Okay.
Su pregunta.
¿Cuál es el papel de España en cuanto al control de este comercio en cuanto a la generación del dinero que viene ¿ha sido desventajoso para España o lo contrario?
Difícil.
¿Ganaba España en este comercio o nada de eso?
Bueno, si consideramos a España solo la península, ganaba,
Okay,
pero ganaba menos de lo que pensaba, menos de lo que creía.
So Spain is earning less than what it thought it would earn.
Y por lo tanto, terminaba no ganando.
So finally, they stopped earning something there from the trade.
Pues su endeudamiento hecho a partir de lo que calculaba que iba a ganar era superior a lo que estaba en condiciones de pagar. Por lo tanto, tenía que entregar más garantías y más concesiones políticas a los actores que le prestaban dinero.
So they had to pay more for those who are trying to sponsor the trips.
No, they had to pay more to their creditors in Northern Europe, I suppose. Supongo en Alemania y Flandes.
Sí, y Génova. Entonces, si se endeudaba a un nivel superior al que podía pagar, finalmente terminaba siendo perjudicada. Entonces, la respuesta es, si España ganaba o perdía con este comercio triangular, perdía.
Okay. So Spain is losing with this kind of commerce. Okay. Está bien, está muy claro. Okay. Is there another question here? Okay, what is far better, the galleon trade controlled by private dominated entity or instituted by Royal Compañía de Filipinas? So, en resumidas cuentas, creo que esa es la pregunta. Is it better that, okay, Yvette, would you like to answer?
No, Rene, I just pressed on that, sorry.
Okay.
I think the other professors will have an answer to that.
Can you repeat the question?
Voy a ver dónde está la pregunta. Desapareció de mi pantalla. I cannot find the question.
Press on the answered. There, answered category.
Okay, ya está.
Yeah.
Okay, what is far better, the galleon trading controlled by private dominated entity or instituted by the Royal Compañía Real de Filipinas?
I mean, at least for my research,
¿Cuál es mejor? ¿Cuál es
I mean,
mejor?
I cannot say which was better. I mean, first of all, better for what? I mean, as Professor Jaime mentioned before, and I agree with him, for the crowd, it wasn't. I mean, relatively speaking, the crowd didn't have actually control of all the trading routes, because there was a lot of illegal trade going on, even though they established a lot of laws and regulations and prohibitions. Illegal trade was one of the key problems of the whole trading links of the empire all along the 250 years of history. Having said that, another issue is that the Manila Galleon and the Philippine Company both were private enterprises. In the case of the Manila of the Royal Company of the Philippines, it was a private company. I mean, the Spanish crown has a lot of actions over there, but nevertheless, it was a private company. So another issue is we cannot say which was better because the Manila, I mean, the Royal Company of the Philippines actually existed during a specific time during the whole Spanish Empire was a lot of threats. We have, I mean, the war between Spain and England. We have the French Revolution. That of course, this affected the same functioning of the Philippine Company. And it lasts, give and take, it lasts less than 50 years, from 1785 to 1834. It was closed. So you can compare 50 years with almost 200 years of the Manila Galleon. I think those will be, I mean, the general issues, the common topics. Then, I mean, generally speaking, I think that if you compare the historical importance, the dynamics that give to trade, I would say, generally speaking, I mean, the Manila Galleon was more important as a system than the one of the Royal Company.
Vale. Gracias. Dr. Shalsita, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out we have to be careful of projecting what we take for granted today as factual to what was taken for granted 2 centuries ago. Because today we take free trade for granted, but free trade itself is a product of historical circumstance. It emerged as a certainty at the end precisely of the 18th century and triumphed after the defeat of Napoleon. It was ushered in by capitalism, but during the time of the 17th, early 18th centuries, the economic philosophy was mercantilist. In other words, every country should try to be self-sufficient. It should minimize trade because it might lose control of its borders. So the economy was subordinated to political considerations. So we have to be careful of projecting what we take for granted today to the world of the 17th century. Manila Galleon is mercantilist in philosophy. It's not free trade oriented.
Okay, so otra pregunta, another question here. Did piracy exist already at the time where they hijacked golds and silvers? So, ¿existía piratería durante aquel tiempo? Creo que más o menos esa es la pregunta. Okay, so anybody would like to answer that question?
¿La puede repetir, por favor?
Preguntaba si existía ya piratería durante aquel tiempo.
Pienso que sí, porque claro, es que todo depende de las fuentes que tengamos. Desde el punto de vista de las fuentes españolas, nosotros lo que tenemos es que ya desde fines del siglo XVI y comienzos del XVII, en Manila se está cobrando el impuesto de la avería, que es un impuesto que pagan los comerciantes para armar flotas, escuadrillas de defensa a las naves de carga. Entonces,
proteger a los
el comercio.
vale.
Entonces, si hay impuesto de avería, hay enemigos y o piratas.
Pues sí se pone, ¿no?
Las siguientes, hay viajes que atraviesan el estrecho de Magallanes, expediciones británicas y holandesas que terminan en Filipinas, ya sea en Manila o en otras partes del archipiélago, que están documentadas. Entonces, pueden ser consideradas también de piratería. Ahora, el tema interesante sería, digamos, la piratería asiática. O sea, hay también dentro para nosotros, el lejano oriente, ese tipo de actividad.
Entre las islas de Asia.
Sí. Sí.
Okay, so there must have been existing piracy during that time.
Of course.
Because of the fact that they had to pay for the protection for the soldiers to protect the navigators. So it is presupposed that there was also such a piracy during that time. Okay, so otra pregunta más o ya cerramos. How many galleons have sunk during that era? ¿Quién quiere contestar?
Sí.
¿Tienen datos?
Sí, hay datos. Hay hay años en que no hay galeones, pero se puede pensar que en un promedio de 2 al año.
¿Se hundieron o 2 galeones que pasearon? No, le pregunté a galeones que se hundieron.
No. No. Desconozco la información.
Okay.
Yes,
may I just say
yes,
something?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Benito Lagarda y Fernandez, economic historian, wrote this book after the galleons. Of course, it was after the galleons, but he also reviewed the performance of the galleons as a whole, as a trade enterprise. He said that actually if you look at the number of seizures of the boats by pirates and the number of shipwrecks, the number is relatively small, probably less than 5%. So on the whole, he says the galleon trade is actually successful in terms of reaching its goals, in terms of being able to go back and forth between Mexico and the Philippines.
Vale. Gracias. Okay, so do we need to go on with one last question, or we just leave this to we'll just forward this to the speakers. Okay, we're getting late, so it's 10:20. So let me just give my final blow to this. So just to give a conclusion before Dr. Saseta will give his closing remarks. Well, I was tasked to give more or less what we have done so far. So I say that the talks delivered during the session 7 panels A and B have proven that there was and there is Philippines-Latin American connection. They shared history, peoples, traditions, goods, and language. It is now a challenge for both worlds how to continue and improve the connections. Okay, so for the final part, let's give the closing remarks from Dr. Fernando Shalcita of the Ateneo de Manila University and former chair of PACLAS.
Thank you very much. Okay, first of all, I would like to congratulate the speakers of today's session and of yesterday's session. Thank you very much. I would like to close by referring us to the German philosopher Hegel, who had a very good insight into the nature of consciousness. He said, we cannot really understand ourselves fully without also referring to others. In other words, we never understand ourselves in a vacuum. It's always myself, yes, but always in relation to those who are not myself. Now, we cannot help but compare ourselves with others as well as see differences between us and others. And I think that is very true when we're trying to understand the Philippines. For many years after independence, we thought we could just focus on studying the Philippines and forget studying other countries as well, except possibly our Asian neighbors. But even in that, we were not so serious. I think what these lectures have shown tonight is that it's not really possible to understand the Philippines without also wanting to understand Latin America. That came out very clearly, for example, in the lecture by Dr. Paulina Machuca yesterday, where she spoke about the influence of Mexico upon the Philippines, which I thought was very important because many Filipinos keep overemphasizing influences coming directly from the peninsula, which of course is wrong because many influences were filtered via Mexico. And then she also pointed out Filipino influences on Mexico, from coconut dishes to cockfighting to vocabulary. Dr. Obispado reminded us that actually during the first decades of the galleon trade, almost half of the goods shipped in the galleons were actually goods coming from the Philippines, especially textiles, which is quite a revelation, I'm sure, for many, because we tend to be modest about our export capabilities. The lecture by Dr. Ramoneda again emphasized the importance of being interested in other countries, particularly in this case, Argentina, where he spoke about the exchanges that took place between Argentina and the Philippines. It is quite inspiring to realize that there was a Filipino called Samson who created such beautiful statues that are still revered in Argentina. At the same time, to realize that actually the brother of the great liberator of Argentina actually took refuge in Manila after Argentina gained its independence. The lectures also about Magellan stopping over in Rio de Janeiro, Guanabara Bay, as well as the lecture by Dr. Rosenblit about the triangular trade, again shows you that it's just not possible to understand facets of Philippine history without also trying to understand more about what was happening in Latin America. Of course, it has been very, very difficult for Filipinos to come to this appreciation for other two reasons, because we have tended to focus our attention on the U.S. Somehow we think that the U.S. is the center of gravity, whereas actually there are other worlds aside from the United States. Also, we tend to think that perhaps we should just focus on Southeast Asia. I think these two presumptions are no longer possible today because the reality is we are part of Asia and the Pacific. The Pacific is really the theater of operations today, aside from the Atlantic. And the Philippines is very much part of Asia and the Pacific. In fact, it has multiple connections in Asia and the Pacific through the Austronesian connection. We are Austronesians, like Micronesians and Polynesians. At the same time, we have this very, very strong Latin connection. So again, I do hope that we Filipinos realize that we cannot just be interested in ourselves. We have to be more open to other countries because in the process, we understand ourselves much deeper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Butch. Well said. Okay, thank you to all our speakers for their brilliant presentation. With that, we end this panel of session 7 of the Philippine International Quincentennial Conference. It is now actually 10:30, and so we just invite everyone to catch the next sessions of other sessions or panels in the during this quincentennial celebration in the Philippines. You can catch the live stream on the Facebook pages flashed on your screen, or join us here in the Zoom for first come, first serve basis by registering at www.nqc.gov.ph/PIQC. This has been your moderator. My name is Renem Salvania. Thank you and have a good day.